My case study is in northeast Scotland, so there are lots of similarities, lots of crossovers with the music amongst the miso. I want to start with a short clip of a Sankey praise night in a village called Cairnbolg in the northeast, on the northeast coast of Scotland, just north of Aberdeen. This was taken in 2005. It's a soiree, a Sankey praise night amongst the evangelical population. I'll just start by playing a couple of minutes of this.
Okay, we'll finish off with 576. There's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. Let's try to sing it. Come on. There's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar.
I'll stop it just there. In my discussions on North East Scottish sacred singing, people are often surprised, and actually it's normally people in the Aberdeen area who aren't involved in evangelical Christianity. They're often very surprised that Southern Gospel hymnody even had any effect on the region, and certainly surprised that it had a major effect around the coastal areas of North East Scotland. The strong influence of this repertoire was largely as a result of the missionary visit to the region by American evangelists Dwight Moody and Ira Sankey in the summer of 1874. Over the course of 2 months, they travelled throughout northeast Scotland and held revival meetings which attracted thousands of people, and they caused a religious and musical transformation of lasting significance. Their missionary seal was fundamental in providing impetus for musical change and introducing a new repertoire, singing style, and performance practice to congregations in the region. And as Amanda was talking about yesterday, it's often just one key figure who revolutionizes a musical tradition and instigates huge musical change. And Sankey was certainly, obviously not just in North East Scotland, internationally, he was one of those figures who just instigated a massive change in Christian hymnody. Their repertoire was contained in the compilation Sacred Songs and Solos, which was published in various editions from 1873. So it's actually just before they arrived in North East Scotland that the compilation was first published. The book was taken up for congregational use in many churches and mission halls along the northeast coast, as in other areas of the British Isles, and they became central to the infrastructure of sacred music performance in the region, inspiring northeast Scots to form choirs, organise concerts, sing on the ship's radio whilst at sea, and hold impromptu singing sessions in their homes. This paper will form an examination of the process by which the fishing communities embrace the ideology and musicality of Southern Gospel hymnody as a preferred form of musical religious expression to pre-existing forms, and the methods by which the repertoire was introduced to the region by Sankey. In addition to this, the paper will include an analysis of performance practice as a means of reflecting and reinforcing Fisher identity, and in so doing discuss why the legacy of Moody and Sankey has been so enduring amongst members of North East Scottish fishing communities. Prior to the 17th century, few fishing communities existed in North East Scotland, and those that functioned were normally linked to monastic settlements. This changed during the 17th and 18th centuries when landowners reorganised rural populations and turned to the sea as a means of increasing the productivity of their estates. And this is a photo of a typical fishing village on the northeast coast. This is the village of Gamery, and you can see that they were rehoused in these fishing cottages right on the coast. They had no land attached to them. So this population, the specific population I'm talking about, had no land and absolutely no other means of earning a living apart from going out to the sea and fishing. So their occupational identity was incredibly strong from the reorganisation of the rural population. Throughout the 18th century, fishing communities were intensely isolated and their inhabitants low in social status compared to members of inland communities. Whereas religious observance on the west coast of Scotland is characterised by the strongly Calvinist Free and Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, much of the rest of Scotland is predominantly Presbyterian, coastal communities of northeast Scotland experienced a dramatic shift from Presbyterianism to evangelicalism in the mid to late 19th century. This had a profound influence on the repertoire of sacred music, and while, for example, the West Coast today retains a strong psalmody tradition, the Northeast Coast has, in contrast, a distinct culture of evangelical hymnody. While the roots of evangelicalism in Scotland date back to the 18th century secession churches, its firm establishment in Northeast Scotland was as a result of the 1859 to 60 Second Great Awakening, which spread across from the United States. During this time, it was reported that, quote, the fishing community have more conspicuously than any other class been brought under the power of the gospel. Northeast Scottish fisherfolk were particularly susceptible to revival in comparison to inland communities, and this was attributed to their emotional temperaments, their disillusionment with the established Church of Scotland, and also in reaction to particularly unsuccessful fishing seasons. Metaphors and images linked to fishing were frequently used at revival meetings at this time, and these, accompanied by seafaring hymns, were particularly appealing to the fishing population. Fishermen began identifying themselves with the fishermen of the New Testament, and this encouraged the belief that fishers are the, quote, first chosen of Christ. Music was an important feature as converts embraced psalm and hymn singing at revival meetings in their homes and on the streets during the Awakening. The revival drew to a close after many weeks in the spring of 1860, but one of the main consequences of it was the seceding of converts from the established church to form separate evangelical assemblies. While this revival had little long-term musical impact, it caused people in northeast Scotland to be more receptive to the subsequent revival efforts of Moody and Sankey when they arrived in Scotland less than 15 years later. The Second Great Awakening had also created a need for a new type of musical expression of Christian faith, which Sankey was able to meet perfectly. And here's a cartoon image of them at that time. Moody and Sankey were this missionary double act. Moody was the preacher and Sankey the singer. Moody was from Chicago and Sankey from Pennsylvania. Their association lasted 29 years, during which time they travelled extensively, leading campaigns in both the United States and the British Isles. Sankey was not just a performer, but also a hymn writer, a collector, and a researcher. While his singing was a great attraction at revival meetings, and he popularised many gospel hymns as a result, he was a prolific composer and produced over 1,000 hymn tunes during his lifetime. Two of his best-known compositions were the tune to The 90 and 9 and When the Mists Were Rolled Away. And although he died in 1908, his voice was recorded a few times. I'm just going to play you a short clip of Sankey singing The 90 and 9, recorded in 1898. I'll just leave it there. His impact in Scotland was made evident in his obituary published in the Scotsman newspaper in 1908, just following his death. It said, Mr. Sankey was far more than a vocalist of exceptional dramatic power. He was in a real sense an inspired composer of sacred melody. He was, of course, only one out of many who produced the first and still the most popular collection of revival hymns, but his contributions were in many cases full of a human appeal that is still irresistible. Moody and Sankey arrived in the northeast Scottish city of Aberdeen on June the 13th, 1874, and they remained in the region for a couple of weeks. Their visit was eagerly anticipated, and over 5,000 people were reportedly present at their first open-air meeting at Broadhill in Aberdeen. And we don't have any pictures of Broadhill, but we do have one of Glasgow, where they were just before they arrived in Aberdeen. And as you can see, it was absolutely packed with people at the time. By their second day of their tour, their popularity had increased dramatically and audience numbers had apparently quadrupled. Hymns were a vital part of this, and subsequent meetings, which were a combination of preaching by Moody and singing led by Sankey on his portable harmonium, referred to by many in Scotland by its nickname, the Kiss of Whistles. And you can see Sankey in this picture just next to Moody playing the harmonium. In the Aberdeen Daily Free Press, it was reported that, quote, the people seemed content to wait any length of time for an opportunity of hearing the singing of Mr. Sankey and the preaching of Mr. Moody. Local newspapers covered many of the meetings in detail. The Aberdeen Daily Free Press published an explanation of them as follows. It said, praise meetings would consist of an address from Moody, prayers and testimonies with hymn singing led by Sankey at regular intervals, accompanying himself on harmonium and joined by a choir. The choir consisted of local singers, both male and female. The hymns tended to all have choruses, which the congregations could easily join in with. It was also common in Aberdeen for hymns to be sung by congregation and choir almost non-stop while waiting outside the meeting places until the start of the services. And it's actually amazing. I was looking through the newspapers in Aberdeen, looking for reference to this revival, and I found that in every newspaper from Aberdeenshire, there was huge amounts of information about the revival. Every day there were these long commentaries about how many people had turned up to the meeting, what they'd sung, what Moody had preached on. It was the big news. It was the main news at the time in this area for the whole time that they were in Scotland. After 2 weeks in Aberdeen, they then continued their campaign and they travelled throughout the region. And you can see here this kind of tour that they made all the way up to Inverness and up to the town of Tain, and then back via Nairn, Elgin, Keith and Macduff. So they really had a huge impact in terms of the places they visited during that time. The popularity of Sankey's hymn writing and singing was self-evident and regularly commented on by the media throughout the campaign. Even during that time, it was clear that the impact of the campaign would be long-lasting, both musically and doctrinally. This was due to the combination of Moody's preaching style and Sankey's approach towards singing the hymns and organising choirs to lead this aspect of worship in the meetings. Although their campaigns were of international importance, the impact of the missionary visit to the northeast was significant in ways that are often overlooked. Sankey succeeded in influencing people with regards to evangelical hymnody and its performance in a number of ways. The classical evangelical hymns in his compilation use a Christ-centered picture of redemption where people can be saved by becoming converted Christians and thus ensuring a place in heaven after their lives on earth have ended. These new hymns became known as human because they were man-made and not inspired, as the Psalms were, and were immediately embraced by members of the fishing population. The lyrics of many of the hymns chosen from the repertoire and sung in the region contain a preponderance of weather and sea-related imagery, and this clearly reflects the realities of living in a seafaring northern community. Hymns of this type clearly express the sea in terms of danger and foreboding, with the concept of God as a calming force and heaven as an idyllic retreat, such as a harbour or island. And it's very interesting, in the last paper, obviously, they chose specific hymns which reflected their own ideas of nationhood and their own thoughts and their own identity at the in northeast India, and it was the same here. It's one example is the hymn Will Your Anchor Hold, and this is a really defining hymn of northeast Scotland. I heard it in a number of places whilst doing fieldwork. It contains a number of sea-related themes and metaphors, and I think I'll just play you a quick extract of a congregation in Torry in Aberdeen singing the hymn as the opening hymn in a Sankey praise night back in 2009. The literal aim of this hymn is to call fishermen to become converted Christians and to put their faith and hope in God so that they will be assured eternal life in heaven. The main concept is of the anchor as hope or faith, and the lyrics challenge their reader or listener to assess whether he or she will keep this faith throughout the turmoil of his or her life. The love of God or Jesus is portrayed as a solid rock, which is firm, secure, and unwavering, and the hymn asks if the person is prepared to put their trust in God. Life is conveyed as a series of storms, rising waters, large waves, strong tides, and dangers such as reefs. Such imagery reflects the literal and metaphorical life experiences of many fishermen. In the third verse, it's assumed that the person's life will end in drowning, a very real concern for northeast Scottish fishermen. According to 2002 statistics, fishermen are up to 50 times more likely to die whilst at work. Up to 50 times more likely to die whilst working there than any other occupational group except the Merchant Navy. And this would have been much higher in the early 20th century. This reflects the sense of urgency felt in the region for fishermen to become converts before they succumb to any tragedy so that they will be assured salvation after death. Heaven is portrayed as a port or a harbour which is reached in the morning after night, which is used as a metaphor for death, and is calm, peaceful, sunny, and bright. In other words, a safe place to rest when the storms of life are over. Now I'm going to briefly look at the changes which took place following Moody and Sankey's visit to the northeast. In terms of instrumental accompaniment, it became widely acceptable for churches and private homes to own a harmonium. Before Moody and Sankey, there was no instrumental accompaniment in worship. While churches started investing in harmoniums to accompany worship and services, it became commonplace for people to buy harmoniums to accompany hymn singing in the homes. In Aberdeen, even when Moody and Sankey were still working in the northeast, harmoniums became available in music shops. And I found this advert from 1874, a music shop in Aberdeen, saying, owing to the religious movement now going on in Aberdeen, under the auspices of Messrs. Moody and Sankey, W. Jerry has had unprecedented demands made upon his musical instruments, particularly harmoniums, whereby the beauty of Mr. Sankey's hymn tunes are developed to great advantage. So this was really a huge, huge thing, a great deal for people in the northeast. Prior to Sankey's singing of sacred material was congregational. Following their visit, solo singing of sacred material became widely acceptable, and a number of singers became known in northeast Scotland as soloists into the 20th century. Choral singing also became more popular following the campaign, especially as the hymns were written in 4 parts. Singing in the workplace, either at sea or in the shipbuilding and gutting yards, also became integral to daily life, and the gospel repertoire was used as a form of testimony, prayer, and work song. And I'm showing you this photo here of fish gutters in the herring industry. Gospel hymnody was always heard in the fish gutting yards whilst people worked. It was this huge sound coming from the gutting yards at the time, where people would all stand around singing these Sankey hymns. From the late 1940s, these hymns were also broadcast over the ship's radio as a way of reaching out to members of the fishing communities, both at sea, across the radio waves, and also at home. And one of the most well-known of the singing fisherman was Jim Mayer, who would go on the ship's radio every night and sing for a couple of hours, singing the Sankey hymns to members of the fishing population. So in conclusion, the missionary visit of Moody and Sankey was fundamental in providing the impetus for musical change and introducing a new repertoire and singing style to northeast coastal congregations. The revival had an enduring effect on established denominations in northeast Scotland, most noticeably the establishment of an entirely new repertoire of sacred music in the region and the introduction of instrumental music to church services. While contemporary Christian music has to some extent eclipsed the Southern Gospel music repertoire, Sankey singing continues to be practiced and performed in the region, particularly in the form of praise nights and by individual singers both in and outside of church. The success of Moody and Sankey's campaign was closely linked to occupational identity of Northeast fisherfolk, and much of the repertoire used reflects their close observation of the dangers of the sea. While previous revivals had profound effects on the coastal population in the region, the lack of infrastructure in terms of repertoire, message, and conversion process meant that they were short-lived. The campaign of Moody and Sankey, however, was long-lasting because of their structured approach and their offering of a specific published repertoire of hymns which were memorable, melodious, and relevant to the fishing population. As participants of an occupation where life was so precarious and could be taken away so quickly, they embraced the peace of mind which the messages of Moody and Sankey, both through sermons and hymnody, were able to offer them. Thank you.
Thank you for this paper about another paper about evangelization with missionaries in Scotland. Some questions? Yes. There's a question here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your fascinating paper. Actually, I have more or less maybe a technical question. Where do you draw the line between hymn and gospel?
Sorry, between...
Where do you draw the line between hymn and gospel in this respect?
That's a good question. That's been discussed in some depth. This Sankey songs and solos, that gospel hymnody, it's normally called gospel hymnody, so it's both. It's gospel, but it's hymnody, so it covers both. Often talk about Southern gospel music, and that's the larger genre within which gospel hymnody tends to be placed. People tend to describe these hymns in many different using many different words. Usually, it would be called gospel hymnody.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, here. Question here.
Okay, thanks for the paper. It's very great. I have a question about the singing style. So you just mentioned Sankey brought new singing style to the fishing community. So could you elaborate on this point? The singing style.
Oh, new singing style. Yeah, of course. Before Moody and Sankey arrived in the Northeast, the overriding type of music used in church worship was psalmody, and it would be unaccompanied. There were hymns had kind of been trickling through such as the Wesley hymns, but generally the overriding type of musical worship was unaccompanied psalmody, led by a precentor, and sung reading the line. So the precentor would sing a line, and then they would follow. So in terms of a singing style, it was really quite different. There was organ accompaniment, harmonium accompaniment. The songs had choruses. They were, as I said in the paper, they were human. They were man-made, rather than the Psalms, which people described as being inspired. So they were and the hymns tended to have choruses, so they were easy to join in on. You would have verse, chorus, verse, chorus. Also, Sankey wrote out the hymns in 4 parts as well, so it was, in terms of choral singing, it became possible to sing in choirs because you had that 4-part harmony that you could use as well. So that, yeah, that's some of the ways in which it differed from the singing of psalmody, congregational psalmody.
Thanks for another great paper. That they introduced instruments into the sacred music seems like a huge legacy. So did that have a knock-on effect with other denominations and churches and repertoires in the region?
Yes, it certainly did. The evangelical, apart from actually the Brethren, who are the very conservative end of the evangelical kind of spectrum, yes, organs became absolutely commonplace in all denominations. The only exceptions, as I said, the Brethren, but also the Free Presbyterian Church, who were, if you think, I suppose in terms of Christian denominations, they're kind of at 2 ends of the spectrum. You have the very strict Presbyterian, Free Presbyterian Church, who would not, under any circumstances, they still won't have any musical accompaniment in churches, to the Brethren. Apart from that, yes, pretty much every denomination would have organ accompaniment. Yeah.
Another question? Yeah.
Just a quick comment. I was a little surprised to hear you talking about Sankey and Moody, a Southern gospel, because they were based in Chicago, and I think there's also a separate Southern gospel tradition that comes out of shape note singing and the sacred harp, and so I'm just wondering if, from the perspective of the UK, they were sort of classified as Southern gospel.
Yeah, it's that's an interesting comment. I've actually recently written a book chapter for a book entitled Southern Gospel, and this is in the editors of that book very specific that Southern Gospel, Moody and Sankey, that whole gospel hymnody legacy was part of the Southern Gospel tradition, that white American tradition, and I guess that's probably because a lot of the hymns in Sacred Songs and Solos weren't written by Sankey. He wrote a lot of the tunes, but the actual compilation, he just compiled the music. So a lot of those hymns would have been from the southern states, and it would have been part of that tradition. He was just the person who compiled that compilation and presented it as such.
Well, thank you very much for this precision, encore, again, about the hymns and the gospel, because what I found astonishing was the adaptation of the hymns into the work as fishermen, as you have shown, women working together and singing and practicing hymns. But is that really gospel? I mean, of course, maybe they are using the word gospel. I don't know. Is it an emic term or an etic term to say we are singing gospels?
Yeah, they would be singing the gospel, singing gospel hymns.
I'm coming a little bit back to our discussion before about the notion of the choir, and is the choir so, in a way, a kind of collective singing which lends itself to the transnationalization of religion through music. So this is maybe one more example of a gospel traveling transnationally and adopting the form of choir music, or not choir music but collective singing, called gospel. But what is gospel? We have gospel in Japan, but it's a very different type of gospel than the gospel in southwestern USA.
Yeah, there's so many different ways in which you can describe something as gospel, or lots of different types of singing have been described as gospel. I'm sure. I think what people get confused by is that Southern gospel is specifically came out of a white American tradition, whereas gospel, just on its own, came out of an African American tradition. So there are these two sort of strands of gospel which often could get confused. So there's the Southern gospel, which tended to be the white American tradition, the sort of white working class evangelical tradition.
Okay, thank you. So I have to say that our coffee break will take place not in the foyer Claude Champagne, but just after the doors, just here. Until